Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode with Trials with Maya Z. I'm Maya. I already have my coffee, and my guest already has his coffee, and we're ready to enjoy a nice coffee meeting, a virtual one, uh, in order to record our conversation and share with you our perspectives on clinical trials and how we can make them better. I'm very delighted to have Moe Alsumidaie here today with me, who is the chief editor of clinical trial Vanguard and has a lot of great experiences. Moe, please introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. Pleasure to meet you. My name is Moe Alsumidaie. I have worked in the industry, clinical trials industry, for around 20 years now. Started my career at Stanford Medical Center, worked at Genentech and Roche and Abbott Vascular, as well as Mount Sinai, before founding Annex Clinical Corporation back in 2011, which is I founded it as chief data scientist, doing computer data science research, still doing that. And I partnered with my colleague, Krishma Shah, who back in 2015 to start up Clinibiz, which is an integrated research organization. And we run study sites across the globe and have done international government consulting, most recently assisting the Thai government with building and establishing research infrastructure and cohesive research infrastructure in the country, making them more competitive in the global landscape, and also consulting with e-clinical technology companies. Krishma Shah, I'm very proud of her. She made the Forbes 30 under 30
Nice.
with our company featured in India. And recently, I started up the clinical trial Vanguard after being with applied clinical trials as a contributing columnist for 13 years. And I've started the clinical trial Vanguard as chief editor, writing about innovative topics in clinical trials and really spreading awareness to make to push innovation forward in clinical research.
You have such a rich background, and you mentioned Stanford, but then again, was there anything particular that brought you to clinical research, Moe? I wonder, was there anything that really defined your career in clinical research?
Absolutely. Well, I can tell you, I must say that I am privileged that my family is a medical family,
Okay.
and my father is a researcher and a physician. Um, and so a lot of that started from inspired from there. You know, I've always been around patients when I was younger. My father has always explained to me what it's like to treat patients, and I've always had a passion for helping people, especially patients in need. And so that's where my passion really started. Um, my mother's side of the family is entrepreneurs mostly,
Oh,
and
wow.
we bridge. So being an entrepreneur in clinical trials is, I got to say, one of the toughest things anyone can ever do because it's a very tough industry to make it. Uh, However, a lot of it has to do with trust and relationships that you have in the industry. So having worked in a variety of different areas in the industry, that's really where my inspiration comes from.
Mm. You're saying so probably 3 or 4 episodes in a row, I'm hearing this word trust, maybe even more. But because I'm still remembering the last few episodes that I recorded, trust was the number one word that everyone was saying is essential in this industry. I wonder, is it because we don't have it, or is it because trust is essential for everything we do? But anyway, I don't want to go into that topic because I know that there is one very particular topic that you're very passionate about and you're speaking loud about and you're innovating in the space, and this is decentralized clinical trials. Decentralized clinical trials boomed, especially after COVID. They existed before that, but let's say we got the official label after COVID. But now there are more and more people saying, hey, this momentum died. Is this really the case? More, what's your perception of that, and how do you see the market right now?
So people are saying that momentum is dying, right? in the conferences, I'm hearing it all over. In fact, we're currently running a survey right now to evaluate that.
Mm.
However, we don't have the results yet. Um,
Oh, so
but
it's still.
there is talk. There's talk, right? And where there's smoke, there's fire. But I think what is really essential for us is to really focus on where the future is, right? We can all talk about today, but I think that it's important to focus about what regulators and what biopharma companies are saying about decentralized clinical trials.
Mm.
So recently at Scope, Rob Goodwin from Pfizer was having quite an extensive discussion around innovation in clinical trials and sort of where Pfizer stands. And what's really interesting is Pfizer was able to, from 2019 until like 2022, they were able to reduce the cycle time performance by removing 3 years in 3 years. So, for instance, we're looking at 8.5 years to first in human to approval planning cycles, reduced from 8.5 years down to 6.3 years in 2019 to 2022. And so, a lot of what Goodwin was talking about, and Goodwin, by the way, is um, senior VP and head of clinical development operations at Pfizer. And some of the things he was saying is that, you know, Pfizer's making public commitments. And for him saying, but we're making public commitments, we have to commit to them. And so what Pfizer is really committing to is, um, you know, uh, when we look at some of the things they're saying is they really want to push decentralized trials forward. For example, telehealth, home health, community partners, flexible sample collection, apps, wearables, and sensors, as well as partnering with retail pharmacies and uh, retail locations to enhance clinical trials. Those are all signs that DCTs are going to be moving forward. Another thing that's really interesting is that FDA is really pushing this as well. When you take a look at, what FDA is saying, especially, and even EMA, like you're seeing a lot of movement and a lot of discussion from regulators around decentralized clinical trials, some of the challenges that they could potentially face, um, even in their even when you take a look at their guidance documents that they've recently created, uh, a lot of those things are being discussed right now and are really being pushed forward. FDA's push really comes from number one, the quality of your data, and number two, uh, patient inclusion, meaning
Mm.
reaching out to those various communities and enhancing diversity in your clinical trials, especially in the United States. To FDA, diversity doesn't mean going to different countries.
Yeah.
It needs to focus on the US population, the
Mm.
diverse population in the US, inclusion there. Um, and so, there was like over at DTR, right, the Decentralized Clinical Trial Alliance, headed up by Craig Lipset, hosted their conference about
Mm.
DCTs, and uh, FDA was there having roundtables talking about the potential for FDA to redefine clinical trials, how to
Mm.
make them more patient-centric and efficient, the adaptable trial frameworks, and how this approach really aligns with the broader transformation of healthcare delivery and treatment modalities.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think actually it was Craig Lipset, if I'm not like mistaken, but I think he was the one who said, "How come decentralized trials are like going down? Where not going down, but like declining? Where actually we just started seeing like decentralized as the normal clinical trial. So now almost every clinical trial has some sort of a decentralized component, whether we put the label decentralized or just a clinical trial. I guess that's not declining, it's actually just massive adoption of the market. So I personally think that right now what we experience is that suddenly we moved away from this early phase of adoption where everyone is out there jumping, oh, I want to try the new things and I want to have all the decentralized clinical trial components at the same time for every single clinical trial. Now it's more about, okay, this is where I can benefit because this is my trial design, this is my schedule, this is actually how I can benefit to make the patient experience better, to improve the quality of the data. And so maybe there are fewer components per trial that are more related to the centralized way of like monitoring and supporting patients. Yes, but that doesn't mean that that's not a form of a decentralized clinical trial. So yeah, I
Right.
agree with you.
I
And
mean, there
what?
are three components to it, right?
Mhm.
You've got
Yeah,
fully decentralized trials, means the
yeah.
entire trial is using decentralized methodologies. Then you've got hybrid trials, where you're fundamentally changing the trial's design by combining in-person visits with remote digital
Yeah.
technologies designed from the start to be mixed. And then you have DCT elements in conventional studies, where
Mm,
you've got primarily traditional trials augmented by or enhanced by specific decentralized technologies or methods.
exactly. Exactly. And I don't think that's actually one thing that we are always getting wrong. And I actually want to like hear your opinion on that. I kind of feel throughout my career in clinical research, going to these conferences, going like through these different phases of first blockchain, then decentralized, now AI, we always jump to like we always focus on the technology, the solution, and sometimes we forget what's the problem we try to solve. So Moe, do you think that that's really the case, and how can we overcome this jump into what's trendy and really focus back on the challenges that we are trying to
I
solve?
think it really depends on what regulators are saying. What's trendy
Okay.
or not, right? What's trendy is, you know, what people are talking about, what's the latest trend in terms of, buzzwords that you hear around the industry, right? What's real is when you got regulator backing behind it.
Mm,
But what's particularly interesting about decentralized trials is that regulators are making a concerted effort to
yeah.
really push this forward. I mean, back when RBQM or RBM, back in the days we used to call it risk-based monitoring, uh, regulators were behind that, right? But they weren't really out there promoting it like they are with what I'm seeing with decentralized trials. So, with regulators with RBM or RBQM now, risk-based quality management, you are seeing it in guidance documents and in the ICH guidance. Um, but or like you have ICH E6 R2, R3, uh,
Mm,
which sort of define frameworks for risk-based quality management. However, you didn't see this concerted effort like you're seeing in decentralized clinical trials, where regulators are going to these conferences, speaking about this, speaking about really pushing the industry to adopt these methodologies. This is something in my career have never seen before with regulators doing this. And so I think that's the difference here between what's real and what's not. Is what are regulators pushing? What are they not pushing? I think that's how you can define between what's real and what isn't.
but in the situation with, let's say, AI,
Mhm.
are you expecting that the regulators will go out and speak about, hey, everyone, implement AI to speed up your processes? Is that what you're expecting to happen, or maybe there's something that I don't see here?
This is an interesting question because decentralized trials was sort of it. The birthing of decentralized trials came out of the pandemic when it was a necessity, right?
Mm,
Pushed by regulators, by telling the industry, okay, we have an emergency here. You need to figure out how to work with your studies. AI is different because AI is coming from the private industry and is penetrating biopharma companies and is not coming from regulators. So, like, for
Mm,
example, you're looking at in silico, right?
yeah.
In silico based simulations where you can essentially simulate clinical trials uh, through artificial intelligence. There's a company called In Silico Trials, and
Yeah.
it's able to we can now visualize when we take a look at like certain aspects, for instance, modeling your trial, taking a look at different patient populations. Um, you know, this company was able to save a pharma company like millions, like tens, like 30 million euros, and reducing the drug development timelines by like 3 years, right? But those are all things where the private industry is now pushing pharma to utilize these technologies. However, when we take a look at operationalizing these technologies, you can still use FDA guidance, right? Like, you have to validate the technologies. How do you validate it? Um, those are all open, right? Um,
Mhm.
Nonetheless, I think that FDA and the regulators will be forced to generate a guidance
Mm,
document around this. Um, so what's interesting is there's been a publication called Towards Good Simulation Practice.
oh
So
wow.
it was just released actually like in February or March of this year. And it really talks about the best practice for use of computational modeling and simulation in the regulatory process for biomedical products. And so we're seeing these publications come out, which are, from what I understand, supported by FDA, supported
Mm,
by regulators, uh,
interesting.
to push this forward. So I think there's the difference. DCTs is being pushed actively by regulators, whereas AI is, regulators going to have to catch up to it. So I think there's a nuanced difference here.
Yeah, a different dynamic. And you actually were, I think you were spot on when you said it's coming from the private industry. It actually is coming from mainly the investors pushing the industry, the pharma companies, the biotech companies, do things more efficiently, do it faster, less capital in investment, like in R&D and so on and so forth. Not less capital, but more efficiently utilizing this capital. So I guess that's the private industry that you're speaking about. Um, that means that they see this pressing need for improvement, and AI may be the thing, like the technology that can actually speed up things. But I wonder if we go back to what are the challenges, because like we discussed, technology can help you solve some challenges, but which are these pressing challenges that the life sciences industry really experience today? And do you think that AI has any role in actually solving that? From your perspective, which are these top pressing challenges, and what's the role of AI there?
One of the biggest challenges is number one, identifying new markets. So, for example, you can identify subgroups where you can target specific patient populations, where if you're using real world evidence, real world data, you can identify them and then generate therapies that can address those specific patient populations. Because the industry, it's very crowded space right now. There's a medication for pretty much every indication we know. However, there are also many gaps within these indications, right?
Uh,
Um, and I think AI can really help with spotting some of those indications. Like, for instance, I'm not a physician, but I'm just giving you a hypothetical example. Let's say that there's like diabetes, right? And uh, a subgroup of the population in Africa does not respond the same
mm,
way that even ethnic minorities in the US respond to this diabetes drug. And then you start seeing that in the medical records that they're prescribed this particular medication, but they're not responding to it. And so that unveils an opportunity to address an unmet medical need, right?
Yeah.
That's one example. Another example is, of course, the handmaid's tale, old maid's tale. I don't know what the colloquial saying is, but it's the ability to increase the chances of success of your medical product and identifying whether your study is going to fail or not beforehand, before even investing millions of dollars into your clinical trials. And I think that's where AI can really help. And we're seeing that already being done. And so what's really cool and interesting about AI now is that it opens a market that was previously inaccessible to many executives, many researchers, many innovators, where they can now access and predict clinical trials and evaluate whether their medical products are going to work on patient populations before going into clinical trials. And
Mm.
so you're really reducing the life cycle of drug development and also opening opportunities. So I anticipate that the field will be burgeoning and booming with novel technologies. Well, we're going to say novel technologies, but rather novel biopharmaceutical companies that are in the startup mode that can now have much higher chances of success.
Mm.
For big pharma, we're looking at, scaled cost savings and efficiency, right? I mean, typically what happens with those smaller companies, they end up getting acquired when they hit phase 3 by big pharma because they
Mm.
have just to run those big studies. Um, but maybe it'll get to a point where those smaller pharma companies won't need the funding of big pharma to run
Mm.
those clinical trials because they have a good idea. And when we're talking about the future of clinical trials, we're looking at, for instance, digital health technologies or DHTs. AbbVie recently reported in one of they were speaking at Scope about some case studies where they were using DHTs that significantly reduced the number of patients needed to achieve their study's outcomes using DHTs. Um, and there are opportunities in so many disease indications and therapeutic indications where these technologies can be used. Psychiatry is a big one,
Mm.
and CNS is a huge one because the traditional, um, for instance, like some of the traditional methods, the the battery tests that we use, right, to evaluate and analyze patients. Imagine now being able to analyze patients' depression moods by evaluating the way they look into an application,
Mm.
evaluating eye movement, evaluating facial expressions and engagement, evaluating intonations in your vocal cords, which can all be done with AI nowadays.
Yeah.
That can be a lot more precise in evaluating the subtle differences in improvement compared to those traditional battery tests, which tend to be pretty highly subjective, despite the
Yeah.
standardization that comes with it. AI can really fine tune that to, maybe previous drugs that were not approved can now be approved because the traditional tests, battery tests, were not able to detect those subtle changes in differences in the patients. So I do see that there's definitely big opportunities here to be approached. So yeah.
Mm. But Moe, I have an interesting question. You mentioned the digital biomarkers, and I also like love the whole idea, and I'm very convinced that this is a completely new like approach to diagnosing and monitoring patients and their disease progression. But if you have to think of the adoption of these digital biomarkers, do you see that happening first in healthcare and then clinical research, or you think clinical research should lead the way to adoption of digital biomarkers? How do you see this happening?
So it's interesting because I recently took a course by the Dime Society, which is the I need to take a look at what they actually stand for.
Yeah, I don't
The
know the variation. I know
Digital
this
Society, Dime Digital
exactly.
Mechanism Society. Yeah. So they actually recently released a course called Building Fit for Purpose Sensor-Based Digital Health Technologies, a crash course. And it's actually really interesting. If you go onto our website, the Clinical Trial Vanguard, and you do a search for DIME, you'll be able to find a summary that I wrote on it. And
Nice.
it's actually targeted for healthcare professionals. However, these approaches can also be applied towards clinical trials. And so they created a way in which you can validate your digital health technology, or DHT, in clinical research, where I interpreted it as clinical research, where you have to verify your device, you have to do a usability validation, you have to do an analytical validation, then a clinical validation, and then they have this entire V3 plus modularity approach where you can
Mm,
evaluate the DHT. And so one thing, going back to what AbbVie was saying, is that the way they've been able to successfully integrate DHTs into their clinical trials is to engage regulators early. So a lot of you can actually you can create your own DHT in a clinical trial as long as you go through the validation process and prove that it works. Then you can approach regulators and say, hey, listen, we don't need to use this battery test. We've done a validation on this device. Here are the specifications. Here's the validation of this device. And see what the FDA says, right? Because this validation device is not only validated scientifically, but also accepted by patients if you follow this framework. And
mm,
so FDA is all about the patient and making things a lot easier for the patient. So if you can demonstrate that, and you offer the plus that it's more patient-centric, more patient-friendly, they're much more likely to say, yes, you can use this validation in your clinical trial, or this validated device to measure your outcome in this clinical trial.
yeah, that sounds like really cool. I really hope that we can adopt quicker the digital biomarkers. I guess that there will be a lot of like challenges regarding like what device actually you have and like how exactly you're using that. But then again, that comes with really an interesting promise. And thanks for sharing that. Where do you see the future of clinical trials? Like you kept repeating the future of clinical research, the future of clinical trials. Do you have this ideal world in your head where clinical research should go to?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what's going to happen is we're first going to see digital twins.
Nice. Yeah.
So you're essentially running simulations in clinical trials in humans, but you're not using humans. You're using digital twins, which is essentially patient-specific data to create highly tailored treatment plans for patients. And so, like, the data-driven approach, as I was mentioning earlier, can really enhance the prediction of those responses and reduce the likelihood of adverse effects, right? So, for example, like digital twins have been used in oncology to simulate various chemo regimens to identify the most effective and least toxic combinations for a patient's cancer profile. And so you're bringing personalized medicine into clinical trials. As my generation, I'm a millennial. Um, and as we get older, and we become elderly, we're not going to want to go to the doctor's office and sit there for 3 hours. I was a participant in clinical trials before, and it was awful. I gotta say, like, it's such a big waste of time. Sitting there for
Mm,
3 hours with the sites sort of not knowing what to do, trying to figure things out, sitting there filling out a bunch of forms when I could have been doing all of this at home, right? This was when I was living in California. I had to drive all the way to Sacramento, like an hour, to visit the site to do these assessments. And it took like almost an entire day to do a study visit. People don't have time for that anymore. I don't, right? And so I see the trials coming to us, like where healthcare has gone, where my medications are being delivered to my home, like my groceries are, and so I see also the use of sensor data being integrated. So this is what's really cool and interesting. I recently saw this presentation by uh, who is it? His name is Dr. Michael Snyder, who
Okay.
runs the Snyder Lab at Stanford Medical Center. And what's really cool is that like he's doing a lot of research around personalized biomarkers. So for example, like, the average human temperature is 98.6, right? But the true average is 97.7 with a notable spread between individuals, right? And
Mhm.
so what is a fever for one person might mean a fever for one person and not for another, right?
Yeah.
And so this omics approach, when you take a look at, for instance, another example he provided in there, um, like he was talking about some of the strategies, like with biomarkers discovered through omics. So like you can, for instance, identify like pre-disease. So for instance, a set of biomarkers for evaluating, like the example he gave is like, okay, here's my norm, but something was acting strange, like his heart rate was going up, um,
Mm.
and he was on the plane, and his smartwatch oximeter picked up unusual changes in his physiological data. For example, like a significant drop in blood oxygen levels and an unexpected increase in the heart rate while he was on the airplane, and it remained well after he landed. And so something was amiss. He went and got tested, and he's sure he had Lyme disease. And so
Wow.
these changes in the baseline from your baseline, I think, really helps with understanding vitals. So rather, when it comes to clinical trials, rather than um, rather than going, falling off the stairs and because you're dizzy from a medical product, right? And that potentially being an adverse event and detecting it, like before patients even feel a
Disease.
symptom,
Yeah.
you can see those changes in those omics, in those digital biomarkers, and be able to report the adverse event before it's unsafe for the patient. So I
Mm.
see less adverse events, uh, assessments being done at the patient's home or close to the patient's home, for example, at retail pharmacies, um, or even at local healthcare providers. That I've got my reservations about local healthcare providers because operationally creates an entire, it's kind of hairy when it comes to compliance and monitoring all of that. But um, scalable uh,
Mm.
locations that are close and
Mm.
convenient to patients' homes. I see things being delivered to me. I see consenting being done remotely through digital devices. Yeah, that's where I envision the future of clinical trials. They're safer, they're more patient friendly, they work around our schedules, around our lives, um, and also being able to just wear biomarkers, like digital biomarkers that
Mm.
could detect issues beforehand. The blood samples would be taken, like micro sampling is now, um, I know Theranos was sort of in the news for like falsifying data, but one of Dr. Snyder's studies with microsampling, they use this technique to provide samples and then analyze like for a broad range of like health indicators. And one of the discoveries they made was this approach of like early detection diseases like lymphoma and precancerous conditions, which were identified before any of the symptoms were noticeable by the patients. And so like pre-symptomatic detection
Mm.
through microsampling, that's going to be the future also. Like you don't need to go to the core lab and get 10
Yeah.
tubes of blood taken from you. So
Yeah.
yeah.
That's interesting. I can envision. the endpoints will be completely different in the clinical trials, and that's all awesome. Thank you so much for sharing with me and in my network your vision. I just wonder, you mentioned a lot of things actually, and they all sound incredible. But I wonder if there is one, if you have to choose one thing that will have the biggest impact on clinical trial success today, what would that be from your perspective today?
I think, running study sites and running studies with pharma companies, I can tell you the biggest challenge that we face is patient friendliness and
Mm,
putting yourself in the patient's shoes. Because it's really surprising to me, having worked at the site side, working all the way at the
mm,
sponsor, managing studies, and coming back to engaging with patients, I can tell you that sponsors still don't involve patients. It's clear to me when certain studies have not involved patients in their design. Um, and it's hard when you're a study site and the patients are disrespected almost. Like, for example, um, like there was this one study we were running. It was a neurology trial, and the PRO device for children, by the way, it was for pediatrics,
mm.
was this old clunky device. I'm like, everyone's using smartphones and ePro. Why do we have to use these clunky devices? So not only
Yeah,
were they hard to use, but they were malfunctioning on top of that. And so, our coordinator would call and we'd get a call from a patient and the patient's mother or the parent saying, well, I don't know how to use this thing. It's not working. It's connected to the Wi-Fi, but it's not functioning. It's not prompting me for the questions. And so what the patient said is that this sponsor does not care about us. They don't
yeah,
care about us
yeah,
because this is not how we want to do the study. And they
yeah,
dropped that. They're
yeah. I
like,
can.
that's what I mean by being disrespected. Another example, you know, like we're recruiting patients for this rare disease trial, and the study sites are just not as engaged. Um, and so when we make the referral over, we hand them through the process and we're with the patient. But the study sites have other priorities and they're not walking the patient through the process. So the patient gets lost, insurance coverage doesn't kick in, and then
Mm,
their window of opportunity to enroll in a trial expires. And
mm,
so here's the patient desperately seeking therapeutic options, but no longer is able to qualify for the trial because the workflows are not streamlined.
yeah,
Those are things that I think the sponsors really need to think about is put yourself in the patient's shoes, understand where they're coming from, and understand not only the complaints that you're hearing from the sites, but also like listen to your patients because you're ultimately serving your patients.
mm, yeah. That's actually the disconnect. I would say disconnect. You mentioned disrespected. I would say disconnection to reality,
Hmm.
because your reality right now, like the sponsor's reality in most cases, is drawn by, is provided by the doctors, by the investigators, let's say. Sometimes it's even worse, like by the key opinion leader, the one behind the publication. But the reality is the reality, the life and the daily schedules and activities and pains and challenges that the patients actually go through, of course the site as well. So yeah, I hear your words, and actually you, I would I would say again, patience disrespected. That was powerful, Moy. And thank you very much for sharing that. Thank you everyone very much for sharing everything today. Actually, it's been incredible conversation. Very like very a lot of things that I learned as well. I'll try, and I hope you can help me collect these different links and publications that you mentioned and the course that you mentioned, because I'm pretty sure that a lot of people would like to dive into these publications and materials as well. And thank you for making the time. And also, thank you for not just naming the challenges and the future, but also that you're working towards this future through your work, through your chief editor role as well. So, yeah, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Maya. And my hope is that through this publication, we can really push the industry forward. I've been doing this for 20 years, trying to push the envelope forward. But my hope that is that with the clinical trial Vanguard, we can really make people's voices heard and make those innovations really resonate with the industry. It's one thing to have a regulator speak at a conference that not everyone goes to, but it's another to have it disseminated
Yeah,
widely so that everyone from the top to the bottom can understand what's really happening.
yeah. And like you said, for that we need trust and collaboration. Thank
Absolutely.
you, Moe. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure, Maya. Thank you for hosting.